In the hours and days after the assassination, the Secret Service collected assassination films and pictures from the hands of private citizens. What those citizens got back wasn't exactly what went into the hands of the government. Sometimes there was a combination of damaged and removed frames. And sometimes the alteration was more contrived. We can see some of the splices and other tells of alterations to the Zapruder film for ourselves, with Clint Hill disappearing and reappearing within a single frame, and a lamp post jumping from one side of the street to the other, or the limousine flag appearing between the hand of the bystander and the camera's point of view, which, of course, is physically impossible. These and other tells show us that the Zapruder film, as we know it, is a fabrication. So is there a way to know what was on the original film? To some extent, there is. There are the witness statements, and we'll get into some of those. There are also a handful of individuals who claim to have seen a version of the Zapruder film different from the extant film. A copy of the original film was believed to have been made by someone at life before it was altered at the CIA Hawkeye Works facility, and was shown at a small number of college campuses or other locations. Greg Burnham is one such individual who reportedly saw this other Zapruder film. Here is some of what he had to say about the film that he saw.
So as that car began to come down that decline, I guess you'd call it, the gap between the Queen Mary and the SS X100 grew by, I'm going to say, at least 2.5 to 3 times the distance that it had been originally. The distance it had been originally, we're talking probably maybe a motorcycle or 2 lengths apart from each other. And it probably grew to 6 to 8 motorcycle lengths, at least, possibly more.
Why is the gap important? Because it meant that the Secret Service follow-up car driver would have had to speed up in order to close the gap and return to the normal distance of about 5 feet behind the president's limousine.
Just before the headshot, the car slowed way down and then came to a complete and full stop. Not a rolling stop, none of that, a complete and full stop. So unlike up at the corner where I said that there was a hesitation and perhaps a complete stop, definitely going extremely slow. I'm not going to go and say I'm sure that it stopped because I'm really not. But farther down, around where the steps are, there was a complete and full stop of the car. And it was in that stop when the kill shots occurred.
The so-called kill shot, happening when the limousine was near the bottom of the stairs instead of just past Mary Mormon's position, is something we'll come back to later.
In the film that I saw, I was able to see the Queen Mary at the same time that I was seeing the X100.
During the time these shots took place while it was stopped?
Yeah, at the time that... And the Queen Mary was still coming up from behind, and apparently had to slam on its brakes, or it would have run into the back of the X100.
It wasn't the stopping of the president's limousine that caused the AR-15 headshot, so much as the stopping of the follow-up car, the Queen Mary, which Burnham said slammed on its brakes. We think Burnham was only able to see the front of the follow-up car, but not the back half, where Hickey was positioned. The sudden stopping of the follow-up car is what caused Hickey to fall, with the momentum throwing him forward towards the president's limousine. So what about that back and to the left head snap? Did it really happen?
And it had to come from behind because it caused him to bolt forward.
His head could be seen to move violently forward.
Because it flipped him over, almost on his stomach. Now, one unintended artifact of alteration, as I've already discussed, was speeding up the motion of the body to the left and the rear. Speeding that up and making it look so much more violent really implied a frontal shot. That, I believe, was an unintended artifact of alteration.
So how much of the extant Zapruder film can we trust? In our view, not much at all. Since the Zapruder film is not authentic, we don't really know what Kennedy's actual head position was. His head could have been in any position, including this one. We like the EOP entrance, and not just because the autopsy doctors insisted it was the correct location. There is evidence of the EOP entry in the Harper fragment. The fragment was described as occipital by non-government pathologists based on the fragment's bony characteristics. Importantly, the fragment contained a small smear of metal on the outside of the bone, indicating a bullet entry at this location. Dr. David Mantik, MD, PhD, apparently a very smart man, and Dr. Michael Chesser, neurologist, also apparently a very smart man, got permission from the Kennedy family to see the autopsy materials in the National Archives, and permission from the family is the only way one can see these materials. This is an autopsy photograph available publicly, showing part of the president's skull with the scalp or hair reflected, that is, with the skin and hair pulled back away from the bone. It's been called the mystery photograph because doctors who only have access to the cropped version of the photograph, the one we see here, have been hard-pressed to orient the photograph in terms of front, top, back, right, left, etc. However, there is another version in the National Archives, which again, one has to have permission from the Kennedy family to see. There are apparently landmarks visible in the Archives version of the photograph, the one Drs. Mantik and Chesser saw, which include eyelashes, a nipple, and part of the Y-shaped autopsy incision that help to orient the photograph. In this photograph, we see an area that Dr. Chesser describes as, quote, highly suggestive of the Harper fragment, end quote, and is where both men believe the Harper fragment came from. And both men agree that the hole we see here is at the back of the head, in the occipital area. Dr. Mantik created a skull reconstruction based on the mystery autopsy photograph. His reconstruction places the Harper fragment at the back of the head with the metallic smear indicating bullet entry right at the EOP location where the autopsy doctors said the entry was. Dr. Chesser largely agrees with Mantik's placement. But there are problems with the blowout hole being at the back of Kennedy's head. Other autopsy materials don't match a blowout hole in that location. David Lifton's sarcastically titled book, Best Evidence, presents some of the inconsistencies with the autopsy accounts that led to his theory of body alteration prior to the autopsy. Lifton published some of the autopsy photographs in his book, such as this one, nicknamed the Stare of Death photograph, which shows a blowout at the right front of Kennedy's head and no blowout at the back of the head. Autopsy x-rays seem to show the same thing, a blowout at the right front of the head, but not at the back. However, the overwhelming majority of witnesses who actually saw Kennedy's body at Parkland Hospital or during the autopsy, with two notable Dealey Plaza exceptions, which we'll discuss shortly, reported a back of the head blowout, a hole about the size of an orange or a baseball with missing bone and scalp. Could so many witnesses have been wrong? Or were the autopsy pictures and x-rays wrong? They can't both be right. The guy who took the x-rays, Gerald Custer, told Vanity Fair that the autopsy x-rays were fake. And the guy who took the autopsy photographs, Floyd Reeb, said that the pictures were phony, not the images they took. Dr. Mantik, who again viewed the purported original materials kept in the archives, examined pairs of autopsy photographs taken from slightly different angles through a stereoscopic viewer. These should have appeared as 3D images, and for the most part, they did, except for the area where witnesses described the back of the head blowout. That area appeared two-dimensional, indicating a forgery made by composite pasting of the same image into the corresponding photographic pairs. White House photographer Robert Knudsen, although he was not listed as the autopsy photographer of record, told the HSCA that he had taken autopsy pictures of Kennedy. After Knudsen passed away, his daughter told the ARRB this.
Many times over the years I said, you took those pictures, and he always said, yes, they took the film in the room, and he said, and I never saw them again until the pictures surfaced in the hearing. And I was asked about the pictures, and this was in the late 70s. And then the pictures started appearing in the public, and it's been on TV specials and everything since then. And when those pictures first came out, I saw them, and I said, so you had to go down and see your pictures? And Dad said, no, I saw the pictures. And he said, those weren't pictures. He said, they've been altered. And my father has always contended those pictures were altered. He said they were not taken. Those were not the pictures as I took them. His wording. So those were not the pictures as I took them.
Knudsen's son told the ARRB that his father told him the room background wasn't right, and that hair had been drawn into the photographs.
Yeah, he said, that's not the right room right there. Meaning that's not what the room looked like. Some of the pictures that are in that were published, he said the room didn't look like this.
The background detail, for example.
Background, and he said that there wasn't that much head showing, you know.
I'm sorry, what do you mean?
Not as much head showing, meaning that someone had drawn in the hair, covering up the wound.
And where was the wound covered? I mean,
the top back, more than the top back in the picture that we were looking at then. So he didn't point to it. He said they put more hair than really there.
Saundra K. Spencer, who worked at the Naval Photographic Center, processed at least some of the autopsy photographs. In her ARRB deposition, she described interesting differences between the pictures she processed in 1963 and the ones she was shown in her 1997 ARRB deposition. In the 1963 pictures that she processed, quote, there was none of the blood and matted hair, end quote. Presumably, this was the photograph she described as not looking like any of the images she processed in 1963. Spencer said that the body in the 1963 pictures looked more pristine than in the 1997 pictures. There was no blood on the head support, on the ear, and in the hair in the pictures she processed. She didn't remember a metal head support, but she did remember a darker cloth in 1963 than the towel seen in the 1997 images. Saundra Spencer wasn't the only one to not remember a metal head support. Other witnesses, like Paul O'Connor in William Matson Law's In the Eye of History, described a chalk block head support. That is, a solid piece of rubber. Ms. Spencer said that the room or background she saw in 1963 looked different. In other words, that the background was darker in the pictures she saw in 1963. Some autopsy witnesses have said that there was no phone on the wall, and researchers with sharp eyes have noted the inconsistent widths of the tiles. It wasn't so much the tiles or phone on the wall or type of head support that mattered, it was the wounds on the president's head. Ms. Spencer said that the 1963 pictures did not show the massive head damage as in the photos she was shown in 1997. She also said that in the pictures she saw in 1963, the eyes and mouth were closed and the face did not have as much stress as in the photos she was shown in 1997. Yet here in the autopsy photograph nicknamed the Stare of Death, the eyes are open and, well, staring. The mouth is also slightly open. Some researchers have pointed out that between the time he died in Dallas and the time the autopsy pictures were taken, his eyes would have dried out. The apparent liquid eyes in this image means it cannot be authentic, regardless of whether or not his eyes were closed at Parkland. Saundra Spencer described a small wound of about 2 inches at the back of the head, not the extensive wound, presumably at the front right of the head, as in the 1997 photos. Of course, 2 inches is smaller than we think the blowout would have been, but Spencer may not have seen the entire wound or the size of the wound in relation to other objects of known size in the 2-dimensional images she saw in 1963. And of course, her deposition was taken more than 30 years after she saw the original images. Ms. Spencer did not see a measuring device, which is a fancy term for a ruler, or hands in the 1963 pictures. And note that in the image on the left, the hands would have had to belong to 2 different people, with a right hand on top and a left hand on the bottom, which seems rather odd to us, but there you have it. Another thing that's odd is this presumed cowlick bullet hole dubbed the red spot by some researchers. It's odd because it seems to have hair growing out of it. And while we're talking about this photograph, we want to point out something that Dr. Humes said in his HSCA testimony, or actually before his actual testimony, when shown a photograph showing the cowlick entry.
The transcript, which was made from the tape recording of that interview, at pages 12 to 13, reflects that you reviewed not only that drawing, but a X-ray of the president's head, and identified the small droplet in the lower portion of the photograph as a wound of entry, and that was the only wound of entry. Later in the transcript at pages 39 to 40, the following colloquy occurred. Dr. Petty of the panel said, going back to the earlier discussion, "Can I go back to another interpretation which is very important to this committee? I don't really mean to belabor the point, but we need to be certain as we can be, and I'm showing you now photograph 15. That, of course, was a photograph from which that drawing was made. And here, to put it in the record, is the posterior hairline or margin of the hair of the late president, and there near the midline and just a centimeter or 2 above the hairline is an area that you refer to as the in-shoot wound." That, in other words, was a verbalization of the description of the location of the small droplet near the bottom of the head. You replied, Dr. Humes, "Yes, sir." Dr. Petty then continued, "Also on this same photograph is a ruler, and approximately 2 centimeters or so down the ruler, and just to the right of it is a second apparent area of defect, and this has been enlarged and is shown to you in an enlargement, I guess number 16, which shows you right opposite the 1 centimeter mark on the ruler this defect, or what appears to be a defect. Thereafter, skipping a small portion and going to the very next page, 40, you replied, "I don't know what that is. Number one, I can assure you that as we reflected the scalp to get to this point, there was no defect corresponding to this in the skull at any point. I don't know what that is. It could be, to me, clotted blood. I just don't know what it is, but it certainly was not any wound of entrance."
We also want to point out how Dr. Humes was asked about the autopsy images. If you pay attention to this next clip, you'll see that Humes was actually asked whether various aspects of the drawing made by Ida Docks corresponded with what was in the photograph.
Would it be accurate to state first, Dr. Humes?
Yes, sir.
That at the point at which you made the statements we have just referred to, you were called rather unexpectedly from your normal occupation, came to Washington, and with no preparation or no referral to prior notes immediately prior to that, were shown this and other evidence and made the statements that I've just referred to.
That's correct, and I'd comment that I was similarly summoned on Tuesday of this week, 48 hours ago, for this appearance, likewise with no attempt or no chance for preparation and no idea of what questions were to be directed towards me.
And we apologize for the short notice in both cases.
Fine. Hope we can straighten it out.
We included that bit at the end because we thought it was interesting. No preparation to review his notes or whatever, and he seems a bit angry, and Cornwell is smiling for whatever reason. Next, pay attention to the questions Dr. Humes was actually being asked.
I'd like to ask you if you would agree to various portions of what are reflected on this photograph. First, that in the original photograph, there was shown, as on the drawing, a ruler. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in addition, there were the hands which are shown, which appear to be holding the scalp so as to expose some portion of the back of the head.
That's correct.
Would you also agree that in the original photograph, the hair in the upper portion appears to be wet, that in the lower portion appears to be relatively dry?
I would indeed.
Would you also agree that the hair is spread apart in the upper portion of the photograph, exposing portions of the scalp, and that in the lower portion, the hair is in a relatively natural position?
I would.
And finally, would you agree that the relative center portion of the photograph has what you, upon initially being shown this photograph in the archives by our panel, could not identify? That's what you said might be a clot or some other item, and that it's relatively off-center in the overall photograph, the part you identified as being the wound of entry. The locations are as I described them.
Yes, apparently.
As to what Humes was actually being asked, it was about the drawing that he, along with the rest of the world, was being shown, and whether it matched the photographic image on which it was based. What could he say but yes? This, ladies and gentlemen, is how dissemblance and plausible deniability are created. Humes was asked about whether a drawing of a likely composited photographic image matched the same likely composited photograph. He was not asked whether the drawing or the photograph matched with what he witnessed during the autopsy. This manipulation of evidence also serves as an intimidation tool, because if the witness describes something other than what is being shown to the world as he talks, it makes the witness look like an idiot. In fact, as we just saw in his description of the photograph, Dr. Humes specifically said that he didn't know what the purported defect spot at the cowlick was. That layer between the drawing and the photographic image created the dissemblance and plausible deniability. If the drawing matches the purported autopsy photograph, why couldn't the photograph itself have been used instead? Why did the HSCA have to hire a medical illustrator to reproduce the photograph in drawn form? Because, if shown the photograph under oath, Dr. Humes might have had to admit that it really didn't match what he saw during the autopsy. But when asked if the drawing matched the purported photograph, he could agree that it did. See how that works? And if Humes happened to tell the world that the drawing showing the world what really looks like a bullet hole is wrong, it makes him look like an idiot. Or maybe puts his pension in jeopardy, as some researchers have suggested. And just as an aside, researcher John Hunt reportedly found a note from HSCA pathologist Dr. Michael Baden to Ida Docs, telling her to make the cowlick spot in her drawing, quote, look more like a bullet hole, end quote. Unfortunately, we can't find an online image of that note to show you, but given everything else we know about the autopsy images, we don't really doubt the note's existence. Here's the HSCA drawing by Ida Docs showing the back wound. Again, the drawing is supposed to be based on a photograph. But note that neither the drawing nor the photograph really depicts a wound on the neck. Again, we ask, if the drawing is supposed to be an accurate depiction of an actual photograph, why couldn't the actual photograph have been used in the first place? We're pretty sure the drawings were commissioned to add yet another layer of plausible deniability and obfuscate the facts even further. For example, the artist could have been directed to crop out where the back of the head displays sharp contrasts in lighting, indicating authenticity issues in that area. Back to Ms. Spencer. The throat wound that Saundra Spencer saw in the 1963 pictures was about a ½ inch, not a gaping gash type of wound as she was shown in 1997. Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who was one of the doctors who attended Kennedy at Parkland Hospital, also said that the throat wound was definitely not a gaping gash.
Compounding the mystery is this photograph of the government's autopsy, showing a gaping wound in the president's neck. A tracheostomy incision was done at Parkland over the site of the bullet wound. Crenshaw says someone tampered with that wound after he last saw Kennedy's body, making it larger to resemble a bullet exit wound.
Look, this is the size of the tracheostomy tube. Incision was made and then placed in. This large part, this flange, stays outside.
So it was a small wound, about the size of the instrument
right.
Saw.
An inch to an inch and a half, maximum. This wound, and described in the Warren Commission, was almost 3 inches wide.
Double the size.
Double.
Is it possible that the doctor working to put this in what may have been already a bullet wound made the incision too large?
Oh, no. Perry was an artist with a blade. He was one of the best trained technical surgeons.
Saundra Spencer told the ARRB repeatedly that there was no correspondence or no similarity between the images she was shown in her 1997 deposition and the pictures she processed in 1963. And it wasn't just the content of the images that was inconsistent with what Spencer remembered processing in 1963. The paper that the pictures were printed on was demonstrably different. Ms. Spencer had brought with her to her deposition a photograph that had been printed about 10 days before she processed the 1963 autopsy images as a sample of the type of paper she had used at the time. The supposed autopsy images she was shown in 1997 were not printed on the same paper that she used in 1963. The watermark was different. The Kodak logo on the back of the paper she was shown in her 1997 deposition was smaller than in her 1963 sample. The only possibility Ms. Spencer could think of to explain the discrepancies between the pictures she processed in 1963 and the pictures she was shown in 1997 was that the pictures she had processed in 1963 were made after an extensive reconstruction of the body, perhaps for the purpose of having an open casket funeral. However, mortician Thomas Robinson did not describe such an extensive reconstruction. He said that all that was needed to hide most of the damage was a pillow to hide the damage at the back of the head. And to add one more important back-of-the-head blowout witness, Jacqueline Kennedy, in the redacted portion of her testimony, not uncovered until years later, seemed to indicate that she saw no wounds in her husband's face, but only at the back of his head. So the purported autopsy photographs are not to be trusted. There was no front of the head blowout. The back of the head was not intact. There was no cowlick bullet entry wound with hair growing out of the supposed entrance hole. As for the autopsy x-rays, Dr. David Mantik, whose specialty is oncology radiology, meaning that he looks at x-rays for a living, has some things to say about that. The extant x-rays appear to be a combination of authentic imagery and alterations or forgeries. In the AP x-ray, that is, front-to-back x-ray, this circular bright object, measuring at 6.5 millimeters, the exact diameter of Oswald's purported bullets, is a forgery, superimposed over what appears to be a small but authentic crescent-shaped fragment. Dr. Mantik asserts that on the x-ray in the archives, you can actually see the crescent-shaped fragment inside the diameter of this white spot. It's important to note that the AP x-ray, taken from the front to the back of the head, does not show depth, that is, whether this object is at the front or back of the head. It shows right versus left. Meanwhile, the lateral x-ray, or side view, tells you front versus back. And here is where the same fragment appears to be located on the lateral x-ray, apparently at the back of the head. It's too small to be the large circular 6.5 millimeter object shown in the AP view. Neurologist Dr. Chesser describes a deliberate obscuring of the facial bones in the publicly available x-ray on the left. Dr. Chesser describes this area as having been darkened, thereby obscuring the facial features. But we want to note that in the AP or front-to-back image on the right, even in the dark area, we can see the circle of the orbit around the right eye, which is interesting because if the orbit is still there, then what the hell is missing? These images are the so-called computer-enhanced x-rays readily found online. We have more to say on what computer-enhanced means in a moment. In the right lateral x-ray, that is, the right side x-ray, Dr. Mantik describes an area he calls the white patch. Dr. Mantik measured the amount of light passing through various points on the so-called original in the archives using an optical densitrometer machine which measures the amount of light passing through an image. He discovered that this white area is so white that the skull would have to be solid bone passing from one side of the skull to the other for the white patch to be authentic. In other words, it's not authentic. And heck, we can easily see that one apparent fracture line stops right at the edge of the white patch and then apparently picks up on the other side. Weird, huh? Here's the less cropped version of the same image. The fact that we don't even see the very bottom of the head in this image is something we'll come back to. Dr. Chesser agrees with Dr. Mantik that the extant X-rays are not authentic, for the same reasons, and even adding a couple. For one thing, Chesser says that the sella turcica, the sickle-shaped thing here, is too big. We think we know why. We made a video overlaying an X-ray taken of Kennedy when he was alive with the so-called enhanced lateral autopsy X-ray, increasing the transparency in steps of 10% and then reversing the process. We found that many of the landmarks, including the sella turcica, are exactly the same on both X-rays, as if both X-rays had been taken from exactly the same distance from exactly the same angle. The so-called computer-enhanced lateral X-ray is really a composite made with the help of the living X-ray. Just look how closely the living X-ray aligns with the, quote, enhanced autopsy X-ray, when so many of the skull and facial bones reportedly had been shattered. And then there's this dark area, which we like to call the black hole. This area is so dark that, as Dr. Mantik says, the entire brain would have to have been missing in that area, even though the X-ray was taken before the brain was removed, and the official brain exam purportedly showed a nearly intact brain. Autopsy witnesses described the left side of the brain as being mostly intact, while the right side was largely obliterated. But that's not what the X-ray shows, or even what the official brain exam reports. This sketch is supposedly of Kennedy's brain, which was photographed during a separate examination some days after the autopsy. Note that despite the, quote, extensive lacerations, there is very little matter actually missing, which is contrary to witness accounts that described nearly the entire right side as missing.
I could see his eyes were fixed, and I could see through that hole in the skull. Most of that brain matter was gone from that area, so I assumed it was a fatal wound.
Well, that certainly doesn't sound like a mostly intact brain. ARRB analyst Doug Horne found evidence of two completely separate brain exams, one showing very little brain matter missing, and the other presumably showing much more of the brain missing. So again, note that in the autopsy X-rays and photographs, all the damage appears to be at the right front of the head, except there's this image in the HSCA documents. Note the caption, an occipital defect would be at the back of the head. Looks like somebody forgot to change that before the report was published. And not just the caption, because it also looks like they forgot to crop off the bottom, as was done in the versions of the so-called enhanced X-ray you can more readily find online. Let's consider the front of the skull to be on the right side, as the commonly found right lateral X-ray image seems to show. But this area looks to us like it might be the mastoid process and the spinal column, indicating the neck. We noticed that if you flip this image and rotate it a little so that the neck bits are at the bottom, you get a blowout location at the back of the head, occipital, right where the caption and the witnesses described it. Even the HSCA's AP X-ray caption describes an occipital defect, which means back of the head, although we're not so sure that the original image was as dark as all this. So, blowout at the back of the head? Well, Clint Hill would know. Clint Hill not only got a close-up view of Kennedy after he ran to the back of the limousine and pushed Jackie back into her seat, he was also called to the morgue after the autopsy to view the body so he could report back to the family. We've not found any interviews where he discussed what he saw in the morgue, but there are a number of interviews where he talks about what he saw in the limousine.
It hit him in the back of the head here and exploded right out the right rear upper part of the skull.
Wait, what was that? Did he just say that matter exploded out of the rear of Kennedy's skull while indicating the front of his head?
It hit him in the back of the head here and exploded right out the right rear upper part of the skull.
Yep, he did. Well, maybe that hand gesture at the front of the head while saying the back of the head was just a one-time aberration. Maybe his hand was just too tired to reach all the way to the back of his head during that point of the one interview, because elsewhere in the same interview, he does this.
I could see his eyes were fixed, and I could see through that hole in the skull. Most of that brain matter was gone from that area.
Or maybe he just forgot where on the head he was supposed to indicate.
So when that third shot hit, it hit the back of his head here and exploded out the upper right rear quadrant of the skull.
So where was the blowout, Clint?
And the shot actually hit him back here, but it erupted out of the upper right quadrant of the rear of the head. At that time, he was way over to his left and his head was kind of down. So the shot hit him back here, entered back here, but it erupted right out above the right ear.
So now it's between the front of the head and the back of the head, above the right ear?
I gained my footing again, got up in the car, helped her get back into her seat. When I did that, the president fell over to his left into her lap, and I could see the upper right portion of his head, a large hole about the size of my palm.
Thanks, Clint. That really clears things up. When faced with contradictory evidence or accounts, we have to choose which to believe. In this case, we choose the weight of the many witnesses who put the blowout hole at the back of Kennedy's head. Given that the autopsy photographs and x-rays are as suspect as the Zapruder film is, we think the back of the head is the correct location for the large blowout hole. But as we said, there are one or two notable exceptions to the back of the head blowout locations that we need to address. One of the two exceptions was Abraham Zapruder, who went on television immediately after the assassination to describe something a bit different. Zapruder described a front of the head blowout, like we see in the Zapruder film and autopsy photographs. But remember, Zapruder had only had a brief glimpse of the explosive headshot through the viewfinder of his camera before appearing on TV. He hadn't yet seen his film. He may have been fooled by a rapid head turn that made a back of the head blowout appear to be located at the front right side of the head. The other exception was William Newman, who didn't describe a blowout at all in his same-day interview, but pointed to the left side of his head, the side of Kennedy's head that was away from him during the assassination, while describing a shot that he believed at the time came from behind where he was standing, from up on the knoll. We'll return later to the origin of the shots and explain why, acoustically, Newman first thought they originated from behind him. For now, We'll note that the side he points to in his same-day interview was the side of Kennedy's head that was away from him, where he couldn't really see, so was probably speculation rather than observation. We also note that his story has changed over time, and usually those changes have been more in line with the official version of events. We don't attribute anything nefarious or deliberate to the changing recollections, but we recognize the reconstructive nature of memory, especially when presented with contrary evidence, that is, so-called evidence that is contrary to fact, such as a doctored Zapruder film or doctored autopsy photographs, in a phenomenon that cognitive experts call the misinformation effect. In her same-day interview, Bill Newman's wife, Gail Newman, doesn't describe any blowout, but describes Kennedy as reaching for his ear, which is something we'll return to later. Again, we like the weight of the majority of the back of the head blowout witnesses over the one or two, or really only one, contemporaneous front of the head blowout witness. But that presents us with another problem, because a large hole is indicative of an exit, not an entrance, and we like the EOP entrance for the AR-15 shot. We'll return to that mystery, never fear. For now, let's take another look at that HSCA lateral X-ray with its caption saying it describes an occipital defect or a hole at the back of the head. Because if this is the authentic metal fragment, and we flip the image to put the blowout at the back of the head, an occipital defect, it puts the described authentic fragment at the front of the head, somewhere in the forehead. Well, isn't that interesting? So Donahue's ricochet fragment at the back of the head doesn't seem to have been at the back of the head at all. And when Dr. Humes pointed to the apparent cowlick entrance for the HSCA on September 7, 1978, he may actually have been pointing to the front of the head, albeit on a flipped and composited image. However, 9 days later, in a closed-door session with the HSCA's forensic pathology panel, Dr. Humes marked a skull model with the EOP entrance. It can be very confusing for anyone trying to follow all this, which was most likely the point of the enhanced composite image and the white patch and all the other alterations to the autopsy evidence. And speaking of confusing, we have this rather bizarre statement made by Dr. Humes under oath to the Warren Commission. Quote, "Scientifically, sir, it is impossible for it, the shot, to have been fired from other than behind, or to have exited from other than behind." End quote. And immediately after he said that, his Warren Commission questioner changed the subject. We don't really think the bullet made a U-turn, but we have to look for an explanation other than the official stories we've been given, since the official stories don't hold together. So how to resolve this apparent paradox of a bullet both entering and exiting the back of the skull? For that, we go back to the witnesses, because a large blowout hole at the back of the head doesn't rule out a smaller hole or two elsewhere. Autopsy witness FBI agent Francis O'Neill drew this diagram specifically describing an exit above the ear, as well as the back wound and the throat wound. We like this above the ear location as the exit point for our AR-15 shot. James Jenkins, then a Navy corpsman, described a small wound in that area with a gray circumference. Jenkins thought it was an entrance, although the autopsy doctors didn't specify whether it was an entrance or an exit, only that the wound had been, quote, caused by a bullet. This is a higher location than where we think the wound actually was, but this picture was taken decades after the assassination, and he was apparently indicating by feel rather than looking in a mirror. Dr. Michael Chesser, who wrote a chapter in James Jenkins' book, describes a hole resembling a bullet wound above the ear in the lateral autopsy X-ray. In our HSCA image, Chesser's apparent bullet hole is here. When the image is flipped and rotated, it's here. The X-ray by itself, however, doesn't tell you whether this wound was an entrance or an exit. But we'll take Dr. Chesser's word that it's above the ear, just maybe a slightly different location than Chesser thought. An exit above the right ear would also be consistent with the Warren Commission exit, although there are things we don't like about this sketch. But the entrance and exit shown in the sketch are consistent with the wound locations of the Chesser hole, although we prefer this image flipped and so on, the O'Neill sketch, and probably even the higher Jenkins head point. But given what we like and don't like about the images, we apparently still have a big problem, because bullet exits, as a rule, are larger than their corresponding entrance wounds. And what we have here is exactly the opposite of that, a blowout entrance and a small exit. But we're still not done with the wounds. The throat wound, for one. Even if it wasn't this huge gaping gash, there was definitely a wound there. If it didn't come from the back wound, then where did it come from? There's one more wound that needs to be noted, a small wound, but an important one, possibly the most important one. There are a handful of people who reported seeing this wound in person or in a picture or film. Of course, the images some of them describe, pictures or film, are not any images we can show you. Those images don't seem to exist, at least not anymore. We can only show you these images, which hint at it. We're pretty sure these images are altered. Kennedy's eyes were closed at Parkland Hospital, and during the autopsy, his head was on a rubber chalk block, not a metal support. But we do think that this wound in Kennedy's forehead, which is not in the official accounting of wounds, actually existed, because we've got a witness who can tell us when Kennedy was shot in the forehead, and other witnesses who saw the effects of this shot from other perspectives. This wound has nothing to do with the phony back and to the left head snap we see in the extant Zapruder film, which was an unintended consequence of film alteration. Learn more about this forehead wound in Part 6, The Kill Shot.